A burning awning, a blind cat throwing itself into the flames, an old woman collapsing beneath thick black smoke. And yet, her voice still rose through fire, through wind, like the soul of a forgotten people refusing to die. This isn't just a story. It's the last flicker of memory, the journey of someone once deemed invisible, who made an entire city stop and listen. Somewhere in the silence, a mute child speaks her first word. A stray dog becomes a student, and a daughter lost for 40 years finds her way home. Before you enter the Last Awning, the story of Maame Serwaa, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories where memory and heart collide. Under the late afternoon sun, the choked air of Kaneshi Market danced with dust and scent roasted plantain engine oil, old books forgotten under plastic sheets. The market was winding down, yet the heat clung to the corrugated iron roofs like a memory refusing to fade. At the far end of the main corridor, past the peanut vendor with no teeth and the kiosk that sold cell phone chargers next to fermented kenki, stood a shuttered bookshop. Its windows were smeared with city grime, its wooden doors swollen and flaking with neglect. And yet beneath the faded signboard, Uaraid's wisdom and stories, a kind of congregation, began each day as the sun started to tilt. It was here that Maame Serwaa sat, always at the same spot, always with her back resting against the wooden shutter, always under that warped tin awning which groaned with every shift of breeze. At 70, she moved like the wind had grown inside her bones, slow, deliberate, fragile, but full of purpose. Her hands calloused and ink-stained from another lifetime, cradled Oba, the blind calico cat, who never strayed far from her lap. One of Oba's eyes had clouded entirely. The other was milky with time. And yet the cat stayed still, listening every evening, as if the stories Maame Serwaa told weren't just for children, but for any living creature clinging to what remained of a world once whole. The children came first in ones, then in silent clusters. No introductions, no demands. They didn't ask her name, only the story. Their faces were smeared with charcoal and sun, their feet naked, some still holding bags of scrap metal or mangoes they hadn't sold. But the moment they sat under that awning, they belonged to something sacred. Today, Maame Serwaa would say, her voice steadying, though her hands trembled, we speak of Anansi the spider, and the day he tricked death herself, and that was it. The alley would hush. Even the buzz of the generators from the tailor's stall seemed to drop to a whisper. Her voice was not loud. It cracked in places, dipped and rose like tide against a reef, but there was thunder beneath its softness. She didn't read. She remembered. With every line, her gaze danced not on the children, but to the space in front of her, like she could still see the savanna plains and dusty hills of a childhood long buried under cement and city noise. Kwame had been watching her for a week before he dared press the red circle on his recorder. He had found her by accident trailing sound. A journalism student, Kwame had been wandering the markets for a class project on urban narratives. His classmates were chasing buskers, food hawkers, old boxers who shadow-punched near betting shops. But he had heard something different, an echo that cut through chaos. The first time he heard her, he had frozen mid-step, half hiding behind a display of empty plantain crates. The words were old, yes, but the way she told them. It was the tremble before thunder, the hush before a monsoon. He had grown up on screens, not stories. But this wasn't nostalgia. This was survival memory. Today he sat closer still at a distance, just outside the semicircle of children, one leg folded under him, notebook out, recorder on. He told himself it was for school, that it was cultural preservation. But deep down he was hungry. Hungry for something he didn't know he had lost. Serwaa's voice painted a marketplace where Anansi danced in women's clothes, convinced death to sit and eat stew while he tied her shadow to a tree. Her hands moved as she spoke, not in grand gestures, but in precise arcs that made the spider come alive. The children giggled, gasped, leaned forward. Even Oba's ear flicked. The sun kept sliding west. Kwame glanced at the waveform on his phone. Strong, clean lines, no distortion. He would clean it up later, maybe add some djembe beats in the background. He had no idea what he'd call it. Maybe Kaneshi Chronicles? Or just Serwaa? Her name alone felt like a door. But names held weight in Gatsand. Names could bind and free. And Maame Serwaa, no one knew where she came from, really. She said little of herself. Some said she had once taught at a school that no longer existed. Others whispered she had been the daughter of a village priestess, that her stories were inherited from shrines, that she had lost a husband in some distant coup. But gossip melted in front of her like dew on coal. What remained was her presence, solid as the concrete beneath the market, transient as smoke. That day, something shifted. A boy, maybe 7, clutched a rusted spoon like a scepter. He didn't speak. He never had. But as Serwaa described Ananse climbing into the sky on a silk thread to steal fire, the boy stood, walked to her, and laid the spoon at her feet. She paused, looked down, and nodded once, solemn. The moment was electric. Kwame held his breath, not daring to ruin it with a click or whisper. The world outside the awning surged back slowly. Vendors shouted final prices. A trolley banged over a pothole. Oba purred softly, rubbing her blind face against Serwaa's wrist. And the story ended. No flourish, no the end. Just silence. Then a child whispered again. Serwaa chuckled deep in her chest. Tomorrow, if the gods let us keep this roof. The children stood scattered like leaves. Some lingered, eyes downcast. Others ran, some to trouble, some to shelter. Kwame stayed seated. She turned to him finally. Her eyes still black, still bright, fixed on him without question. You've been listening, she said. Not accusing, not inviting. Just stating. Yes, Mame, he answered, voice dry. Your stories. They need to be heard. She laughed again, but this time the laugh broke in half part joy, part wound. And who will listen, boy? These streets, the ministers who forgot us, the ones who burned books in '83. Kwame hesitated, then held up his phone. Everyone. If I do this right? Everyone. Her eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in assessment. The way an elder looks at the fire someone else has just lit. Then don't clip the ends. Don't make me neat. I am not a proverb to hang in your app. I am blood and bone and thunder. Kwame nodded, unable to speak. She looked past him, then past the crates, past the afternoon, past the world that had rushed ahead without her. Oba curled tighter in her lap. The sun dipped just a little more. Shadows stretched like arms over the market. And under the awning, that had no name under a roof so easily missed the heart of Ghana, beat slow, steady, unforgettable. Under the thick evening sky of Accra, somewhere between the hiss of oil in roadside pans and the distant groans of trotro engines. Something unexpected began to stir, though it started quietly, almost invisibly. A file no larger than a song. A recording just under 7 minutes long. The voice of a woman none of them knew. The laugh of a cat no one saw. And a story about a spider, about death, and about a trick so old it felt like it belonged to their bones. Kwame uploaded it late one night, sitting cross-legged on the thin mattress in his shared university dormitory. His laptop wheezed like a tired horse, the progress bar crawling through the upload like syrup sliding uphill. The podcast had no intro music, no flashy logo, just a plain thumbnail of a cracked sidewalk and a shadowy figure seated against the wall. He called it Chuyen Kwa Serwaa, Serwaa's story in his mother tongue, but simple enough for anyone to understand. He didn't expect much. Maybe a few classmates would listen, maybe a lecturer or two. He certainly didn't expect what came next. At 7:03 a.m. the next morning, his roommate nudged him awake with a phone in hand. Your thing? It's trending. Kwame rubbed his eyes, heart sinking. What thing? The story. It's all over WhatsApp. My aunt in Kumasi just asked me if I knew who the Spider Woman was. He grabbed his phone. Notifications were stacking like bricks. Comments, shares, DMs. Even a community Facebook page for Ghanaian folklore had reposted it with a caption, "A voice from the forgotten corners." Listen, remember. By noon, Maame Serwaa had been streamed over 12,000 times. By sundown, the number had doubled. But that wasn't what truly hit Kwame. It was the messages. A girl from Ho wrote, "I listened on the school bus. I cried and everyone stared." It sounded like my grandma who passed away. A man in Canada, an Uber driver, originally from Takoradi, messaged, "For 5 minutes, I wasn't homesick anymore." Even more unexpected, a nurse at a retirement home in Cape Coast left a comment. "We play her story in the recreation room." They all go silent. Some cry. One man whispered, "She sounds like my sister." It was as if Serwaa's voice had cracked open, something buried, something ancient, intimate, and needed. The momentum built like a quiet storm. A teacher in Tamale asked Kwame if she could use the podcast in her oral history lesson. She sent back a video of her students aged 9 to 13 sitting on a concrete floor, eyes shut, listening. One boy placed his hand over his heart and stayed like that for the full 7 minutes. Then came the letter from Nsawam prison. A handwritten envelope. Inside a note, "I am inmate number 543. I have no family visits, no books, no comfort, but I heard the story of Ananse and death, and I have not been that free in years. If there is a second part, I beg you, let it reach me." Kwame stared at the letter for hours. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of the unexpected. He had only meant to preserve a story. Instead, he had opened a door. But back in Kanishi, the woman whose voice now circled through cities and headphones had no idea. Maame Serwaa sat beneath the same warped awning, the same crumbling bookstore, her back bent like a comma, forgotten at the end of a sentence. The children still came, though now there were more. Some said they had heard her through a friend. Some asked if she would repeat the tale from the radio. She didn't understand at first. "I'm not on any radio," she said. But then someone held up a phone, played her own voice back to her. She listened, blinking. "Ah, that's me," she said softly. But I told it better that night. Her fame was growing, but her circumstances remained unchanged. That week, the market grew tense. Authorities had begun cracking down on unlicensed loitering. The sellers whispered about a new regulation coming from above about cleaning up the outer edges of the marketplace. The ones who slept there. The ones who didn't buy or sell. The ones who didn't matter. Maame Serwaa, for all her storytelling gifts, was still seen as clutter. Oba, her blind cat, was labeled a nuisance. Then came the morning that nearly shattered everything. She was telling a story to a group of children this time about the talking yam that refused to be cooked when a man in municipal uniform approached. His orange vest was too clean. His clipboard bounced against his belly. "That animal is not sanitary," he said, pointing at Oba. "She's blind," Serwaa replied without turning. "Doesn't matter. You can't keep a cat in public space." "She is not kept," Serwaa snapped. "She stays. That's different." The man stepped closer. "You'll need to remove her. Or I will." One of the children stood. "Don't touch her." The man ignored him and bent to grab Oba by the scruff. The cat hissed a ragged, broken sound. That's when Maame Serwaa moved. With more strength than anyone expected, she pushed up from her seat, arms wide like a shield, placing herself between the cat and the man. Her knees shook. Her slippers scraped on the pavement. But she did not yield. "You touch that cat, and I will curse you in the name of my ancestors," she said, voice trembling, but not with fear. The man laughed. "You think curses work on bylaws?" And then, without warning, he shoved her. It was not violent, but it was forceful. Her body jerked backward. Her shoulder hit the corner of the shutter. Oba shrieked. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then click, a sound. Kwame, who had arrived moments earlier, phone in hand, had recorded the entire confrontation. He stepped forward, eyes cold. "Sir, you've just pushed a 70-year-old woman while she was protecting a blind animal. On camera. In broad daylight. In front of children." The man's face drained. Look, I was just doing my job." Kwame didn't reply. He was already uploading. That video, silent but explosive, hit the internet like fire on dry grass. "Don't touch Serwaa" trended within hours. Someone edited the clip with Serwaa's voice layered in the background, her talking about death being tricked her, saying she is not kept. She stays. It went viral, but Serwaa. She sat back down under the awning, gently pulling Oba into her lap. She stroked the cat's spine like tuning a chorus string. She looked at the children, most of whom were still frozen. "Well?" she said softly. "What did the yam say next?" The children laughed, nervously at first, then openly, and the story continued. That night, as the sun drowned itself in the Gulf of Guinea and the heat clung to the concrete like an uninvited guest, Chuyen Kwa Serwaa crossed 1,000,000 streams. And Maame Serwaa, still unaware of the exact shape of the storm she had started, slept with Oba curled under her chin. She dreamt of a land made entirely of sky, where yams walked on 2 feet and cats could see the stars. Rain didn't usually fall in Kaneshie this time of year. But on that day, it came hard and fast, violent like a cleansing that didn't ask permission. The kind of rain that pounded iron roofs into memory and made gutters heave with the city's hidden filth. It slashed sideways against the shuttered bookshop, turned the thin awning into a useless flap of trembling metal, and soaked the pages of discarded textbooks already rotting in the mud. But Maame Serwaa stayed. She always stayed. Even as her shawl clung to her skin, even as Oba whimpered and curled into her lap for warmth, she stayed. The market people had mostly cleared out. Only the stubborn remained, vendors tucking goods under tarps, a few boys stealing glances between thunder cracks. And Serwaa, ancient and unmoved, telling her stories like she was trying to hold the world together with voice alone. But not everyone saw her that way. In the growing void of her fame, envy began to fester. The man's name was Yarrow. Another drifter. He'd arrived 2 weeks earlier with a cough and a rust-colored hoodie, taking shelter under the same bookshop awning when Serwaa wasn't there. He watched the children gather. Watched how they leaned into her words. Watched as strangers brought food, water, sometimes even coins. He watched and twisted it in his mind until it wasn't kindness. It was currency. And he wanted his share. So he started with whispers. "She's not who you think," he told a girl selling fried yam by the gate. Those stories. She stole them. Heard them from the radio. Pretends they're hers. "She took my spoon," he hissed to a boy on a bicycle. "I left it here, and now it's gone. Don't trust her." When that didn't work, he raised his voice. "She's crazy." "A witch, you know, she talks to that cat like it's a child. I heard her singing to it at midnight." "That's not normal. That's juju." Maame Serwaa didn't respond. Not at first. She had weathered worse storms than gossip. But the city was changing. And sometimes it only took a push. A notice came from the municipal office. A folded paper nailed crookedly to the wall of the old bookshop. By order of Accra Metropolitan Authority. This structure is marked for demolition. Vacate within 72 hours. No signature, no explanation, just erasure. It didn't matter that the building had been abandoned for years, that it wasn't blocking traffic or commerce, that it had become, in the words of one passerby, a sacred place for stories. The decision had been made elsewhere by people who didn't come to markets unless escorted by cameras and handlers. Kwame found the notice during one of his evening visits. His heart sank. He took a photo, then another. Then he opened his phone, his pulse hammering. He wrote in Twi first, then translated it for Reach. "The city wants to tear down her awning, her only shelter, her only stage. This woman is not trash to be swept away. She is our past, our rhythm, our bloodline," in words. "If we let her go quietly, what will we have left to remember?" He tagged the page for his podcast. Added the video of Serwaa telling the story of the moon's jealous twin. He ended with a call. "Come hear her while you still can. Come see what they want to remove." The post exploded. In less than 2 hours, it had over 50,000 views. People started arriving. Not just children now, but teenagers, parents, artists, journalists. They sat on plastic stools, and overturned buckets held umbrellas against the downpour. Someone set up a canopy. Someone else brought a battery-powered speaker so more could hear. And yet, amid all this, Serwaa remained unchanged. She didn't grandstand. She didn't perform. She told. The same way she always had. But someone else had noticed too. Madame Afua sat across the street in a faded blue Honda Rain trailing down her windshield. She wore no makeup, no assistant beside her, only a notebook and a pair of wide listening eyes. She watched Serwaa for over an hour, watched her hands, her timing, her pauses, watched the silence between the sentences, how she used breath like a sculptor uses stone. She scribbled notes, circled a word, drew a spiral. Then she put the notebook away and whispered, "My God." Afua had spent 22 years in publishing. She had worked with memoirists, folklorists, griots, and ghostwriters. But she had never seen this. Raw, untouched, sacred and unscripted. This is not a project, she whispered to herself. This is a preservation act. But preservation, like stories, was a race against loss. And loss came quickly. That evening, as the storm peaked and market lights flickered, Yarrow returned. Soaked to the bone eyes, wild. The crowd unsettled him. He circled the outer edges, muttering. Then he saw Oba dry and curled in Serwaa's lap, cradled like something sacred. And maybe that's what broke him. "She's not a queen," he screamed. "She's a liar. And that thing," he pointed at the cat, "is cursed." Before anyone could stop him, he stepped forward and kicked. It happened too fast. A single boot aimed squarely at the cat's ribs. A thud, a shriek. Oba flew sideways, hitting a plastic stool. She yowled high and thin and unbearable, then curled into herself, twitching. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted. A child began to cry, but Serwaa said nothing. She rose, slowly, stiffly, rain pouring down her face, her shawl, her bones. She walked to Oba, knelt, and lifted her with trembling hands. Blood on the fur. The cat didn't protest, just pressed her face into Serwaa's shoulder and whimpered. Quaim stepped forward. "Don't touch her again." Yarrow backed away, eyes already dulling with regret. No one needed to restrain him. The crowd turned on him, like silence turns on a lie. But still no one spoke. Serwaa sat back under the awning. Lightning flashed behind her, silhouetting her figure against the cracked wall. She pulled the shawl tighter, wrapping Oba inside it like a child in swaddle. The rain kept falling, then her voice, soft, barely above the rain, but steady. "There was once a boy," she said, "born without a shadow. His mother knew this meant he would die early. So she gave him a gift, a dog that could see spirits." The crowd didn't move, didn't breathe. Serwaa's voice grew stronger. The boy lived, and the dog barked at every ghost. And the boy grew, and people feared the dog. They threw stones. They said it was evil. Until one day a fire came, and the dog dragged the boy from the flames. Water streamed from the edge of the awning, collecting at her feet. And when they found the dog, her paws were burnt, her fur gone, but her eyes, they still glowed. Because love, when true, never blinds. It sees, even in the dark. Oba shifted, pressing closer. Serwaa looked up, at no one, at everyone. She sees. No music played, no camera cut. Only the endless sound of rain and a story that refused to die. The morning after the storm, Kaneshi Market smelled of rust, rain, and regret. Water pooled in the potholes, scattered papers clung to the concrete like forgotten stories, and the air held a silence too dense to breathe. For once, no children waited under the awning. No clamor of stories, no whisper of myths dancing into the sky. But Maame Serwaa was there, kneeling on a flattened mat beneath the buckled awning. She wrapped Oba in an old towel, gently pressing warm cloth against the cat's bruised ribs. Her hands moved slow and careful, the way you'd touch a baby after its first fever. Oba's breathing was shallow. The blood had dried, but the damage lingered in the animal's every flinch. The sky was gray, and so was Serwaa, until footsteps splashed behind her. Kwam. He didn't come alone. Behind him were 4 other students, young, unsure, carrying folded tarps, threadbare cushions, and a can of black paint. They looked like they were building shelter after war. In a way they were. He knelt beside her. We brought something. She didn't speak. He reached into his backpack, pulled out a bottle of powdered milk, a clean cloth, and a battered hot water bag. She'll need warmth. You both do. She looked at him. Then, not the way one looks at a helper, but the way one looks at a bridge. A way across something long feared. Quame glanced at the space above them. The awning sagged like a dying breath. It won't last, he said, but we made a new one. Within minutes, they began assembling it. The tarp stretched between rusted poles held by plastic cable ties and 2 chipped bricks. The cushions formed a half circle. At the center, they placed a short bench covered in red cloth. The back of the tarp bore fresh black paint words, handwritten, uneven, unapologetically proud. Noikechuenku Ghana, the storytelling place of Ghana. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even level, but it stood. Maame Serwaa watched them work, without interrupting her hand, never leaving Oba's back. When they finished, the student stepped away, giving her space. She rose slowly, walked to the bench, and sat. Rain threatened again, but it didn't fall. Instead, her voice rose. You want stories, she said. I will give you truth. And then she did what she had never done before. She told her own. I was 13 when they chose my husband. A man with no teeth and 2 wives already. My father said it was time. My mother, she wept and said nothing. She paused. I ran. The students didn't move. I didn't run far. Just to the border of memory, a village called Obawama. There I slept in the shell of a bus and drank from a broken gourd. I had no plan, just legs. She smiled faintly, and that's where Agyemang found me. A dog, black as charcoal, one eye gone. He sat beside me and didn't ask questions. She closed her eyes. He followed me to every market, every field, every tree I cried under. And one night when soldiers passed by with guns and fire, he growled. They laughed. But when one of them raised his boot, Agyemang bit through his boot and dragged me into the bush. The wind shifted. Even the sky seemed to listen. He took a bullet that night. She looked down at Oba. Love does not ask to be safe. It asks to stay. Kwame swallowed hard. One of the girls beside him had tears in her eyes. Another scribbled notes furiously. Maame Serwaa turned to them. I've told many stories. Ananse, Nyame, the laughing yam. But this one lived in me. A long silence followed. And then from the edge of the new awning, a slow, deliberate clap broke the quiet. Madame Afua had returned, this time not in hiding. She stepped forward, her umbrella folded, her blouse damp, her expression unreadable. You told that without flinching, she said. Serwaa raised an eyebrow. Would flinching make it more real? Afua smiled. No, but it makes me trust you more. She approached with the ease of someone used to entering rooms where no one expected her. In her hands, a folder thick with papers. This, she said, holding it out, is a publishing contract. It's not exploitative. It's not for profit. It's for preservation, for memory, for daughters who still don't know what their grandmothers lived through. Serwaa didn't move. I've worked in books for 20 years, and never have I heard someone speak like you do. You don't tell stories. You awaken them. Still Serwaa said nothing, so Afua asked gently, Do you want your voice to remain after your bones are dust? Serwaa looked at Oba, at Kwame, at the tarp above, then back at Afua. You want my stories? Afua nodded. No, Serwaa said. You want a story? But I am many. I am bruises and lullabies. I am ghost mothers and dancing spirits. I am shame and survival. So if you want them, you ask me, right? Afua blinked, then smiled. She knelt, lowering herself to Serwaa's level, face to face. What do you want to write, Sister Serwaa? That stopped everything. It was not just the words. It was the tone. Respect, not pity. Invitation, not transaction. Serwaa looked stunned, as if no one had ever asked that in 70 years. Her lips parted, then closed. She looked down at her hands, trembling, worn. And then she smiled. I want to write, she whispered, about the girls who ran and survived. She looked up, and about the ones who didn't. The folder remained on the bench for a long time, untouched, as Serwaa told one more tale this time, about a woman who married a river and bore fish that spoke in riddles. The students laughed. Oba stirred. Even the market vendors sweeping away debris paused to listen. Quame recorded it all. But this time, he didn't keep the camera rolling for himself. He streamed it live, and people watched. A woman in Berlin, a retired teacher in Kumasi, a group of teenagers in Tema, children in a refugee camp in Togo. They all listened to a story born before their birth and now reborn in their ears. Somewhere in the world, someone whispered, "She speaks for us." And somewhere else, another whispered back, "She remembers for us." By sundown, the bench under the tarp bore both the weight of stories and the dream of legacy. Not because someone discovered Maame Serwaa, but because for the first time, someone asked her what she had been waiting to tell. And she was ready. It started with smoke, not flames. Thin at first, like the breath of some old angry spirit curling from beneath a crack in the earth. Then it grew a ribbon of ash licking upward into the night, coiling through the empty alleys of Kaneshi like a message carried by wind. The market was sleeping, mostly. The usual rustle of rats in the bins, the metallic creak of tin roofs contracting with cooling air. And beneath the makeshift tarp, labeled Noi Kechwin Kugaana Maame Serwaa, slept lightly her thin frame wrapped in a patchwork shawl. Oba lay curled against her chest, her breathing shallow but peaceful. They never saw the match. They never heard the bottle break. But a figure, quick hunched face obscured by a ripped hoodie, moved like a shadow into the corner of the shuttered bookshop. He knelt, poured something, struck once, twice, then a spark. The fire didn't roar at first. It whispered, a quiet crackle almost delicate. It slid across cardboard and old wood like memory returning to a place it had once destroyed. Oba stirred first. She lifted her head, ears twitching, eyes blind but seeing something primal. Then the smoke touched her nose. She hissed, nudged Serwaa's jaw. Nothing. She nudged again, more frantic. Serwaa coughed. The tarp above them was already bubbling, melting inward. And then flames. It leapt, greedy. Yellow, red, then black with fury. It devoured the bench, the cushion where children once sat, the cloth banner they had painted with love. Oba did not run. She pressed her paws against Serwaa's chest, crying, pawing, mewling. Serwaa opened her eyes to fire, but smoke had already entered her lungs. She tried to rise and fell. Her hands searched blindly for Oba. Her voice was a hoarse whisper lost in the chaos. Then shouts, a distant scream, a metal bucket crashing, then Kwame's voice, "Mame, Mame, are you there?" His face appeared through the smoke, twisted with fear. Behind him, two students, Amma the one who drew, and Joseph the quiet one with burnt hands from building the tarp. They ran toward the inferno, no thought to their safety. Flames snapped at their sleeves, the smoke clawed at their throats. I see her, Amma shouted, her silhouette disappearing behind flame. Oba was at the edge of the bench, now pawing frantically at Serwaa's shawl. Kwame dropped to his knees, reached into the smoke, grabbed the cat with one arm, and Serwaa with the other. "Help me." Joseph dove in. Together they dragged her out, coughing, limp, blackened with soot. Oba lay across her chest, still crying, fur singed, but alive. The fire raged behind them, lighting up the sky with orange terror. Vendors began pouring in with buckets, jerry cans, rags soaked in water. Someone called the fire brigade, but it was too late. The tarp collapsed inwards like a dying heart. The storytelling place of Ghana gone. They carried her to the small clinic on the market's edge. A nurse who hadn't slept in 30 hours took one look at her and began shouting instructions. Oxygen mask, IV, pulse, burn cream. Kwame sat outside the curtained room holding Oba in a borrowed towel. The cat's side rose and fell in sharp, irregular motion. Her paws were blistered, her ear torn. He sobbed without sound, not because he felt helpless, but because, in all the noise, Serwaa had said something. Right before she slipped unconscious. "Agyamang, I'm coming home." Inside the clinic bed, Serwaa drifted. In her dream, she was 12 again. Not in Accra, but in a village made of red clay and stories. The sky was a bruised gold, and a wind moved like silk across the fields. She stood barefoot in a white wrapper, hair plaited a cut on her lip from a beating not yet healed. And in front of her, Agyamang, The black dog, whole, majestic, tail wagging like time had never passed. She didn't speak, just ran. They ran together across fields dotted with baobab trees and stone shrines. Laughter in her chest, fire nowhere to be seen. The ancestors stood in rows along the horizon, draped in cloth eyes gentle. A woman stepped forward in her mother. Maybe the soul of every woman who had ever been silenced. She held out a calabash. Serwaa took it, drank. The voice echoed across the dreamscape. Not yet. Not yet. There are still names you must call, still girls you must reach. Back in the clinic, the nurse adjusted her mask. Her pulse was faint, but steady. Kwame sat beside her now, Oba lying at her feet, wrapped in gauze and cotton. The students had returned with clothes, food, and a letter signed by hundreds. We stand for the storyteller. We rebuild what was lost. Kwame clutched the paper. Tears stained the ink. Outside the clinic, people began gathering. Vendors, teachers, children. They held candles, posters, fragments of burned cloth with Ghana barely visible. A voice called out, "She gave us stories. Now we guard hers. Another you can burn wood, not memory." In the midst of the crowd, Madame Afua stood still, her umbrella useless against the downpour of grief. She looked up at the clinic window, whispered, "We will not lose you. Not to smoke, not to silence." Inside, Maame Serwaa's eyelids fluttered. And the story, though scorched, was not over. The hospital room was cold, too cold for a place meant to hold healing. The walls were a tired beige, the windows sealed shut, and the air carried a trace of antiseptic and grief. But on the narrow bed near the window, under layers of white sheets next to a tray of untouched porridge, Maame Serwaa lay breathing. Barely. Her chest rose and fell with effort. A thin oxygen tube curled under her nose like an afterthought. At her side, curled into a tight ball of pain and loyalty, lay Oba. The cat had not moved much in days. Her side was bandaged. Her eyes half closed, her body rising and falling in sync with the woman she loved. Every now and then, her paw would twitch against the blanket, as if reaching for something even in sleep. Kwame sat beside them, hunched forward in a cheap plastic chair, holding a recorder in one hand and Serwaa's frail fingers in the other. "Are you ready, Mame?" Her eyelids fluttered. She didn't nod, but her mouth moved. "Yes," she whispered, voice like broken silk, the tale of the moon's daughter. He pressed record, and the story began. It took 6 days to record the stories, not because there were many, though there were, but because her voice was fading. Each sentence was a battle, each pause a gasp. But still she spoke because something deep within her refused to let the fire win. Kwame changed the batteries twice a day. He typed all night, transcribed, edited, cleaned. Around them, the students moved like spirits. Amma brought tea. Joseph ran errands. Malik illustrated every story with charcoal drawings taped around the hospital walls, like living totems. The nurse began to slow her rounds at night. Other patients started asking, "Is the storyteller speaking again today?" And Serwaa kept going. "The river once fell in love with a tree," she whispered one morning. But the tree would not move. So the river wept, and from those tears came the mist that still lingers in the valleys. Another day. The hawk and the turtle made a wager: one would fly, one would hide. But only the turtle had patience. She was not just remembering, she was rebuilding. From within broken lungs and shaking bones, a world reassembled itself, story by story, thread by thread. By the 9th day, Kwame had what he needed. But he didn't stop, because something had changed. It was no longer about documentation. It was devotion. This woman, this so-called mad old lady from Kanishi, had shown them a way to remember themselves. And they would not let the world forget her. The title came easily, Mai Hien Kui Kung, The Last Awning. It wasn't just literal. It was sacred. The final shelter beneath which Ghana's oldest stories had been told, not in books or libraries, but in breath on cement beside a cat and the crumbling edge of a forgotten market. Madame Afua returned, notebook in hand, eyes softer than before. "I want every line," she told Kwame. "Don't fix them, don't polish. Let the tremble stay." And so it did. The final manuscript bore no embellishment. The syntax was jagged, some words repeated. But that's what made it pure. alive. Malik's illustrations were added simple, haunting images: a spider with a crown of bones, a dog with stars in its eyes, a woman standing in fire, holding a blind cat. On the dedication page in Kwame's handwriting, for the girls who ran and the ones who didn't. The launch was not grand. Serwaa couldn't attend in person. Her body was too weak. But the event was live-streamed and her face projected on a screen behind the podium, watched as rows of plastic chairs filled with listeners, old and young. There was no red carpet, no champagne, just quiet and reverence. The microphone was passed between readers, students, vendors, retired teachers. Each read a piece from the book. A boy with a stutter read the tale of the whispering yam. A mother read the story of the boy without a shadow. And then a little girl stepped forward. She couldn't have been older than 8. Hair braided with faded beads, sandals too big. She walked slowly, then stopped in front of the stage, holding something in her hand. "I have something for Mame," she said. A hush swept through the crowd. She lifted a bracelet made of forest seeds threaded together with pink yarn. It looked rough, handmade, small enough for a wrist half Serwaa's size. The girl's voice cracked, but she didn't cry. I listen to her voice every night. On my auntie's phone. I don't cry anymore when I hear her. So I made this, because she helped me sleep. Someone gasped. A woman covered her mouth. The girl looked straight into the camera. "Please give it to her." Kwame took it kneeling, both hands cupped. And somewhere watching on a hospital TV, Maame Serwaa let one tear roll down her cheek. She didn't speak, didn't need to. That night back at the clinic, the bracelet rested on the nightstand beside her water glass. Oba, stronger now, licked her paw, then climbed carefully into Serwaa's lap. Kwame adjusted the pillow behind her back. The other students stood nearby, silent. Serwaa looked up. "So it's done." Kwame nodded. "It's real. You are published." She smiled, a slow, tired smile, but full of fire. "Then let the next stories be yours." Amma blinked. "Ours? Yes, I've carried the first fire. Now you carry the next." She took the bracelet and slipped it onto her wrist. "Tell them I heard her. Tell her I don't cry at night either." The room was quiet. But something had shifted. Not sadness. Something lighter. Maybe peace. Maybe purpose. Outside the window, the lights of Kanishi flickered. The market was still there. The bookshop remained a burnt shell. But beneath it all, something new had begun. Not a roof, not a recording, but a promise. And Maame Serwaa, once nameless, once forgotten, now lived in ink, in voice, and in the hearts of children who had never touched her hand, but had felt the strength of her stories carry them through the dark. The morning light filtered in gently, as if afraid to disturb her. It passed through the cracked hospital blinds, danced quietly across the white floor tiles, and came to rest on Maame Serwaa's open palm. Her skin, a soft map of time and touch, did not flinch. The machines near her bed blinked slowly, rhythmically, too slowly. Oba lay on the folded blanket beside her still. There was no motion in the tiny chest, no twitch of ear, no slow push of breath against Serwaa's fingers, only silence. Kwame had brought the cat to visit for what would be the last time. She had been growing weaker, refusing food, her wounds healing in skin, but not in soul. That morning, she lay down beside Serwaa, pressed her head to the old woman's ribs, and simply stopped. No noise, no cry, just stillness. The nurse didn't have to say it. Serwaa opened her eyes, stared at the little bundle of fur with a stillness so profound it shook Kwame more than any scream ever could. Then she sat up. No oxygen mask, no help. She lifted Oba gently as if she were still alive and placed her in her lap. And from her pocket, she pulled out a scrap of paper, folded, smudged, written in her own shaking hand. She unfolded it and read aloud. "If I go first, bury me where you read. If you go first, carry me to where you dream. And either way, remember, you deserve to be loved the way you loved me." Her voice didn't crack, not once. That afternoon, the city council called. The mayor herself, accompanied by the head of Accra's Department of Culture and Heritage, requested an audience. They came not with reporters or cameras, but with dignity, with apology. The council had seen the footage, heard the podcast, witnessed the book. And now, with almost ceremonial weight, they offered Serwaa a place in the city's new elder care residence. The Anidaso home, newly opened, nestled on the quiet edge of Accra, where jacaranda trees bloomed and wind chimes hung from wooden porches. They described the space private rooms, communal gardens, a full library curated with Ghanaian folklore, and a small community radio station built just for oral storytelling. They wanted her voice there, her presence, her wisdom. The invitation was official, but it was also finally respectful. She listened quietly. Then softly she said no. The mayor paused. Why not? I'm not a symbol, Serwaa said. I'm a woman, and I have a home already. Kwame looked at her. So did Amma, and Joseph, and Malik, because everyone knew that wasn't true. Not anymore. The tarp had burned. The bench was gone. The market had moved on. Even her own breath was a borrowed thing now. But no one argued. No one until that night. She buried Oba just after sunset. Not in a cemetery, not in a clinic yard, but under a mango tree at the edge of the market, where stray cats sometimes gathered and children once sat to hear her speak. Kwame dug the hole. Malik carved a tiny wooden marker. Amma laid down a string of forest seeds, a match to the bracelet from the little girl. Serwaa knelt beside the grave, whispered something no one heard, then stood, walked back to the clinic, alone. The next morning she asked to leave. No ceremony, no bags, just her book, her shawl, and the letter Oba had once written. She handed it to Kwame. Read it to me. I want to hear it from someone who believes. His hands trembled. He unfolded the paper, cleared his throat. To the woman who gave me eyes when I had none. You need to go. Go to where there is sun for your bones, and people who will call your name like it's a blessing. Go where stories are not begged for, but belong to. Go where there's a garden, a bed, a door you can close. I am not your home. You are mine, and you deserve to be loved the way you loved me. Kwame looked up. She was crying now. But silently, not with grief. With release. The ride to Anidaso home took 45 minutes. They drove past the burned corner of the market, past the old bookshop, past the bookstore that had started stocking the Last Awning in its front window. People waved as the car passed. Some bowed, some blew kisses. One held up a sign, "Thank you, Story Mother." She said nothing, just placed her hand on the glass. And when they arrived, when the car pulled into the gravel driveway, shaded by trees that hadn't been cut in 50 years, Serwaa took a breath. Her first unburdened breath in decades. The camera follows her feet, slow, moving across the threshold of the Anidaso home. Wooden beams creak softly under her step. Wind catches the edge of her shawl. There's a radio playing low in the corner, a child's voice reading the story of Ananse and the moon's tears. She smiles. Then she sees them. Children, dozens, seated on colorful mats in the library hall. Some barefoot, some in uniforms, all clutching books. And at the very front, under a warm spotlight, sits a single copy of The Last Awning, encased in glass, but opened, red-marked with sticky notes and underlines. They look up. One whispers, "Is that her?" Another nods. "That's her." She steps in. They part gently like water around a stone. A little girl with wide eyes and a nose scar stands up and walks forward. In her hand, another bracelet, this one woven with red thread and black beads. She doesn't speak, just lifts it toward Serwaa. Serwaa kneels, takes the bracelet, places it beside the other, then asks, "What story do you want to hear?" The girl replies, "The one about the river and the tree." Serwaa nods. "Then listen, because this one belongs to you now." She begins. Outside the jacaranda trees whisper, and the last awning, though, gone lives on between covers within voices and beneath a sky that finally remembers her name. The baobab tree stood alone at the back of the Anidaso home, as if it had been waiting for something for someone for decades. Its trunk was thick gnarled, a monument carved by time and wind. Children called it the listening tree. Elders said it had survived storms, war, and silence. Birds nested in its hollows, lizards traced its bark, and beneath its ancient limbs, Maame Serwaa began to teach. There was no chalkboard, no roll call, no bells, just the curve of earth, the shade of history, and the steady rhythm of her voice. Each morning she sat on a low stool beneath the tree, a straw mat unrolled in front of her. Children from the nearby primary school trickled in after their morning lessons, some skipping, some dragging their feet, but all arriving with a kind of reverence. Not because it was school, because it was story. Some brought notebooks, others pieces of cardboard or old receipts to write on. One boy always came with a broken radio shell inside it, slips of paper scribbled with titles, Why Snakes Have No Legs, The Girl Who Married the Drum, The Stone That Sang. Serwaa didn't read from anything. She closed her eyes, as if tuning into a frequency only she could hear, and began. Her voice was slower now, tempered by age and wear. But it carried. Soft and rooted, like something that grew from the base of the tree and rose with each word. She didn't teach dates, she taught memory. And in memory, she found companionship. Maame was the quietest child. She came alone the first time barefoot clothes faded at the seams. A scar cut across her upper lip like a thread gone wrong. Her eyes dark and large watched everything. She didn't speak, didn't gesture, but she drew. While others listened with open mouths, Maame sketched furiously. On old newspapers, leaves, her arms. When Serwaa told the story of the blind goat who led a village to water, Maame drew the goat mid-stride, water swirling around its hooves. When Serwaa spoke of the moon's lost twin, Maame drew two faces, one smiling, one crying intertwined like vines. Serwaa noticed. After class one day, she crouched beside the girl who sat alone at the base of the tree. You draw like you've been listening for centuries, Serwaa said. Maame looked up. No words, but a tiny smile. Serwaa held out her hand. Maame took it. And from that day, they were never apart. They communicated through sketches, through fingers tapped to rhythm, through a shared silence deeper than speech. Maame became Serwaa's shadow, carrying her bag, arranging mats, collecting broken pencils from the other children to reuse. Serwaa never asked what had silenced the girl. But one morning, Maame drew a picture and placed it in Serwaa's lap before class began. It showed a house on fire and a girl hiding under a bed, a woman screaming, then a dog, sitting outside watching. Serwaa held the drawing for a long time, then whispered, "We've both had to run." Maame looked up, eyes full of something neither terror nor hope, but both. Serwaa folded the paper, gently tucked it inside her shawl and said, "Come. Today we speak of what survives." He came 3 days later, a dog, skinny, one ear chewed, eyes cautious. He hovered at the edge of the baobab's shade, head-low ribs showing. The children startled at first, but Serwaa raised her hand. "Don't move." She reached into her bag, pulled a small calabash of groundnut paste and set it on the grass. The dog crept forward, sniffed, licked, then sat. Didn't bark, didn't beg, just stayed. The next day, he was there again. And the next. He listened as Serwaa spoke, tilting his head, as if parsing language, not through sound, but through vibration. Maame, of course, drew him, named him in silence. Ajamangwai. When Serwaa heard her breath caught. Not because of nostalgia, but because somehow, Maame had known. Without words. Without explanation. She reached over, scratched behind the dog's mangled ear, and whispered, "Welcome back, old friend." From then on, Agyemang too became a fixture. Children leaned against him. Maame taught him simple hand signals. He responded to 3 taps on the ground with a spin, to 2 fingers held up with a paw. Serwaa claimed he understood stories. No one doubted her. The council visited one day, cameras ready, officials with pressed shirts and nervous smiles. They came to document the storytelling initiative. Serwaa greeted them with grace, but didn't alter her tone. She told the tale of the minister and the mango tree, a man who built a wall around a sacred tree, only to find it withered when no children could touch it. Some of the council laughed awkwardly, others didn't return. But the footage made the rounds. Clips of Serwaa under the baobab, children sitting rapt, Maame drawing, Agyemang too yawning. People called it the living library. Others called it what school should feel like. Then came the letter from a university in Kumasi. They wanted to archive Serwaa's lessons, to preserve her oral histories, to animate Ama's drawings into educational videos, to broadcast the Baobab sessions weekly on public radio. Serwaa read the letter twice, then placed it on the bench beside her and turned to Maame. "What do you think?" Maame blinked, then drew a tree with many roots. Each root had a name: Kwame, Malik, Joseph, Oba, Agyamang, herself. At the base U, Serwaa laughed, the sound dry but full. Then let's grow. Seasons shifted. Rain came and passed. More children arrived. Some from far villages, some from Accra itself. A professor once sat in the back row and took notes. But still, every class ended the same way. Serwaa would rise slowly. Amma would help gather the drawings. Agyamang too would stretch and follow. And before she left, she would touch the baobab's trunk. Once, softly, a thank you for standing, for listening, for remembering. One evening, after the children had gone and the light turned honey gold, Serwaa sat alone. Amma curled beside her, half asleep. Agyamangwe dozed with his head on her foot. She pulled out an old cassette recorder, the kind no one used anymore, pressed record, and said, "If you're hearing this, it means stories survived. It means love outlived fear. It means silence found a voice." She paused, then added, "And if you're sitting under a tree anywhere in the world and telling someone what came before, then I am there, in the listening." It started with a press release, typed in bold letters, printed on glossy paper, delivered by hand to the front office of the Anitaso home, the seal of the city of Accra embossed at the top like a gold whisper of authority. In recognition of her invaluable contribution to Ghanaian culture and intergenerational education, Madame Maame Serwaa will be honored as the official symbol of Ghana's first annual Storytelling Day. Below it, a lineup of planned events, a ceremonial unveiling of a statue, story booths modeled after the Last Awning, a parade featuring children dressed as folk heroes, and perhaps most galling of all, a limited-run souvenir mug. Serwaa read it once, then again. Then she placed it on the garden bench beside her and stared out toward the baobab tree. Agyamang Swawi stirred at her feet, sensing tension in her stillness. Amma, sitting cross-legged nearby, looked up and signed, "Happy." Serwaa shook her head, slowly. Then she whispered, "They've turned breath into stone." Later that evening, the council representatives arrived in person. They came with handlers, photographers, and a camera crew from a private network. The mayor's assistant, all teeth and smiles, held a brochure featuring Serwaa's face photoshopped into a mural. "Mame, we're so excited," he said. "We see this as not only a tribute, but a powerful opportunity for tourism, national branding, even curriculum development." Serwaa listened, quietly, until they ran out of adjectives. Then she spoke, not raising her voice, but cutting through theirs like a hot blade through wax. "I am not your branding." Silence. "I am not a mug, a mascot, or a statue for sale. I am not nostalgia." The mayor cleared her throat. "But the recognition without listening is decoration." One of the aides chuckled nervously. "We only mean to honor you, madam." Serwaa turned her eyes on him. "I do not need to be honored. I need to be heard." Agyamang growled low. Amma placed her hand on Serwaa's arm, signing, "Say it." And Serwaa nodded. "Come back when you want stories, not souvenirs." Then she rose, turned her back, and walked away. Kwame found her sitting beneath the baobab that night. The air was thick with heat. Mosquitoes buzzed. The tree loomed above like an ancestor holding its breath. "I need to speak," she said. Kwame didn't ask. He knew what she meant. The podcast was recorded in one take. No edits, no music, just breath, wind, and a voice that had spent 7 decades waiting for this exact moment. She sat in the dark, eyes closed, and spoke. "They came to honor me. They came with banners and cameras, but not one came to listen. You do not honor the fire by drawing it. You honor it by sitting near it, feeling the heat, learning not to burn. You do not honor the old by posing them. You honor them by asking what they remember and waiting for the answer." Kwame's eyes blurred as he watched the recorder blink red. Still she continued, "I was not always called Maame Serwaa. Once I was just Serwaa. Then a girl with no voice. Then a woman who ran. Then a woman who lost. Then a woman with a cat and a bench. Then a fire. Then finally someone listened." She paused. "Then, but they still try to make me pretty. Safe. Digestible, like they do to all the old ones. They call us relics, legends, but never teachers. They say vulnerable, but never powerful. They say end of life. But what if it's the part that matters most?" Kwame swallowed. She looked up, directly into the mic. "Don't build statues. Build spaces where stories can breathe, where the homeless are not erased, but invited, where children learn not to look away from wrinkles, but toward them, where silence is not feared but heard." Then she smiled. A slow, fierce, alive smile. I'm not a symbol. I'm a breathing thing. I am still telling. So listen, because the next story might just be yours. Click. Quame ended the recording, and the world would never sound the same again. The episode dropped at midnight. By dawn, it had been shared over 4 million times. Within hours, it was trending across Guyana, Nigeria, the diaspora in the UK, across indigenous storytelling circles in Canada, even picked up by educators in South Korea. The title, "Don't Build Statues," comments flooded in. "I've never heard truth this raw. She speaks like my grandmother if my grandmother had survived. This changes how I see aging. She is fire." Within 48 hours, the city council was forced to respond. The statue was cancelled, the souvenir campaign withdrawn. Instead, they signed a new agreement, one drafted not by politicians, but by community members, educators, and homeless advocates. The core promise: the creation of 5 new public living story circles in shelters, schools, and community centers. Each led by elders, each free, sacred, unrecorded. At the center, Maame Serwaa's teachings, uncommodified, unfiltered, alive. Amma brought her a printed copy of the podcast transcript. She handed it to Serwaa in silence. On the last page, she had drawn the baobab, but this time the tree had ears. Dozens of them, listening. Serwaa touched the drawing. "I have nothing left to prove," she said softly. Amma replied with a sketch, a girl on a stool speaking, a crowd of animals and humans listening, and below it, one word in blocky, careful handwriting. "Begin." Serwaa closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to listen, and the world finally was silent enough to hear her. The day the woman came, the sky was uneven, not storming, not calm, just uncertain, like the air itself was bracing for a story that had waited too long to be told. Serwaa was beneath the baobab, as always. The children had dispersed. The stool was empty. Only Amma remained drawing spirals into dust with a stick, her eyes distant, distracted. Agyemang, too, lay curled in the sun's patchy warmth tail, twitching with each sigh of breeze. Then the footsteps. Not hurried, not shy, just deliberate. A woman, late 40s, perhaps tall, skin the same dusk bronze as Serwaa's hair wrapped in indigo cloth, stood at the edge of the clearing. She held nothing in her hands but the weight of years. Her eyes did not blink. Her breath came with difficulty. Serwaa saw her and froze, not with fear, but with the stillness that comes only when a ghost walks into the room wearing flesh. The woman stepped forward. She carried no name tag, no introduction. Just this, "Mother," one word. A fracture in time. Serwaa's body didn't move, but her face crumbled. Her eyes widened, wet and shocked. Her lips opened, no sound. The woman reached into her satchel, pulled out a photograph, creased, faded. It showed a girl, barely 5, smiling beside a young Serwaa in front of a half-constructed school. The girl's hand clutched a stuffed cloth doll. "I carried this through 4 borders," the woman said. "In all these years, I thought you were dead." Serwaa stood, slowly. "You were lost in the fire," she whispered. "I couldn't find you. They told me. They told me the rebels had—" She couldn't finish. The woman stepped closer. "They lied to both of us." And then they collapsed into each other, mother and daughter. 2 stories torn and now stitched by tears and trembling hands. Amma watched wide-eyed, clenching the hem of her shirt. Her drawings fluttered in the breeze, forgotten. Even Agyemang too stood watching with his ears perked, sensing a frequency deeper than bark or voice, something cellular, ancestral, essential. The woman's name was Akosua, and she had searched for years. Through refugee records, through rumors, through community archives. It was only after reading The Last Awning, after recognizing a phrasing, a lullaby line, did she dare to believe. And here she was. Not to demand answers, only presence. That evening, the baobab glowed in golden twilight. Serwaa sat again in her stool, eyes swollen from crying, but sharper than ever. Akosua sat beside her, not speaking, just anchoring. And Amma, shaken by the reunion, stayed farther back, hands folded tight. She seemed anxious, agitated. She kept looking at Serwaa, then Akosua, then the stone path. Then finally she walked forward. Serwaa turned to her, smiled gently. Amma opened her mouth and spoke. Just one word, one syllable, one universe. Bah! It wasn't loud. It wasn't confident. It cracked halfway through, but it was unmistakable. Serwaa dropped the cloth in her lap. Her hand flew to her mouth. Akosua looked at Amma like she'd watched a flower bloom from concrete. Amma's hands trembled as if the voice had cost her something sacred. Then Serwaa opened her arms. Amma flew into them. 3 generations. No bloodlines required, just storylines. Colliding. The community requested a memorial, not for Serwaa, for Oba. It had been nearly a year since the cat's passing. And yet every afternoon at 4 Hajri, children still left tiny offerings beneath the baobab, a feather, a stone, a fishbone, a drawing. Quaim and Malik spearheaded the effort. Together with local sculptors, they designed a small bronze statue, no bigger than a seated child. It depicted Oba as she often appeared curled gently with her blind eyes closed, tail wrapped around her paws. On the plaque, Oba, the one who stayed. The statue was placed at the base of the tree where Serwaa's stool sat. And beside it, a second inscription, handwritten by Amma. She listened to stories, even when she couldn't see them. She loved without asking for names. She was home before we found ours. That night, as the statue was unveiled, Serwaa addressed the small crowd. Only a few words. I buried her in silence. But you brought her back in stone. She turned to the children. Now every time you sit here, you sit beside the one who never left me. Amma held her hand. Ajamangwe rested his chin on her foot. Akosua stood behind her, hands on her mother's shoulders. And for the first time in memory, Serwaa looked complete. Not peaceful, not finished, but whole. Across the country, word of the reunion spread. But this time, it wasn't viral in the way trends move. It was slow, respected, used in workshops on generational trauma, referenced in symposiums on oral memory, played at libraries where elders were finally invited to sit and speak. And in the radio booth at Anidaso Home, a new program began, The Line Between Us. Hosted by Serwaa and Akosua with Amma's illustrations used in promotional posters. The first episode began with this. Some families break, some forget, but some, wait. That season the baobab bore fruit earlier than expected, and some said the scent of paw prints lingered in the dirt, because some legacies walk on 4 legs, and some healings arrive not with a bang, but with a single word, grandmother. The gallery sat in the old district of Accra, where the air still carried whispers of independence speeches and revolution drums. But tonight it shimmered with softer sound, curious murmurs, page turns, the rustle of cloth as people leaned in, not for spectacle, but for memory. The sign at the entrance was hand-carved. No gold, no spotlight, just dark wood and white paint, simple, respectful, the last storyteller. A living exhibit in honor of Maame Serwaa. Inside light bathed the walls in warmth. A timeline stretched from corner to corner. Not in bullet points or headlines, but in fabric panels embroidered with symbols, a market stall, a blind cat, a burning bench, a baobab. In the center of the room, the stool, the real one, cracked at the edge, burnished by decades of use. Below it, a glass case held Serwaa's original shawl, and beside it, Amma's first sketch of her, drawn in charcoal on wrapping paper. There were no ropes to separate visitors from the space. They were invited to sit, to listen. At regular intervals, the room dimmed, and from above Serwaa's voice played, "This is not an end. The mouth may close, but the story does not. I have spoken it into you now. Carry it well." Kwame stood at the far edge of the gallery, arms crossed loosely, watching the visitors, not with pride, but with reverence. He didn't need applause. He had long since understood that Serwaa's legacy was not his to control, but he had become something she once predicted, a teacher. He now lectured at the University of Ghana Department of Modern Folklore, a department that hadn't existed until the year The Last Awning reached its 4th printing. He didn't lecture from textbooks. He lectured from memory. He taught students to record their grandmothers, to translate lullabies into poetry, to ask their fathers what stories they weren't told and why. He taught them that folklore was not fiction. It was resistance. It was healing. It was truth weathered into shape by time. And when asked how he learned all this, he always said, "I sat beneath an awning, and I listened." Amma was late to the exhibition, not because she forgot, because she couldn't stop drawing. That morning, she had finished the final page of her debut picture book, Oba and the Fire That Didn't Win, written without dialogue, just images, every page a painting. Serwaa on the bench, Oba curled on her lap, flames curling, a crowd gathering, a girl drawing, a tree listening, a woman rising. The book was being published in 3 languages, Twi English and Silence. The Silence version had no words, only illustrations and a note at the end, for anyone who ever spoke without sound and was still heard. She arrived in a blue dress Serwaa once helped sew, holding the first printed copy of her book against her chest like a second heartbeat. She walked straight to the stool, placed the book at its feet, then sat beside it and drew the faces around her. Kwame, Akosua, the children, the baobab even here. And in another corner of Accra, outside a small neighborhood library built beside a health clinic, a new awning had been installed. It was blue canvas stretched tight between 2 concrete walls. Beneath it, a single wooden bench flanked by flower pots. And on the bench sat a little girl no more than 7 legs, swinging off the edge, holding a book too large for her hands. The title, The Last Awning. She read aloud slowly, whispering the words to herself, as if they might run away if spoken too loudly. Behind her, unnoticed, stood Serwaa's statue, not of her sitting, but of her walking. One hand on her shawl, the other reaching forward, mouth open mid-sentence. The statue was subtle, almost lifelike. But the plaque at its base was what made people stop, because it didn't list achievements. It didn't mention awards. It only bore her final recorded words. Người kể chuyện không chết. Họ chỉ chuyển sang tai khác tim khác. The storyteller does not die. They only move into other ears, other hearts. And so she moved. Through podcast speakers in homes across West Africa. Through school books in places where history had once been wiped clean. Through lullabies sung over sleeping babies who would never know her face, but would dream in her rhythms. She moved through Ama's brushstrokes, through Kwame's lectures, through Agyemangtu's footprints still visible in the dust near the baobab. And most of all, she moved through that little girl, sitting under a new awning, reading an old story, out loud, to no one and to everyone. The final frame holds, the book in the child's lap, a gust of wind turning the page, a feather falling from the sky, a voice not in sync with lips, but echoing across the scene. Tell it again, even if no one listens, especially if no one listens. Then, fade to black, a heartbeat, and a bell, soft, hollow, like memory returning home.